Rafinha picks his spot.
Usually when you do go on that shopping spree, you make some questionable decisions. This is a questionable decision. Tactically speaking, Hansi Flick himself made the decision that sometimes he didn't even want to play with a left winger type player.
The new season hasn't even started, and something about Barcelona feels different. Not because they've spent hundreds of millions like some of Europe's biggest clubs, or because they've suddenly assembled the most expensive squad in football, and it's not even because they are defending back-to-back league titles. It's something much harder to explain. Because when you really look at what Barcelona have done this summer, it almost doesn't make sense. Anthony Gordon, Karim Adeyemi, Jesse Basiru, more pace, more runners, more attackers, more intensity. Yet while everyone expected Barcelona to strengthen their backline, they've barely touched it. No elite centre-back, no defensive rebuild, no complete tactical reset, which raises a fascinating question. What exactly is Hansi Flick building? Because this doesn't look like a team trying to become harder to beat, it looks like a team trying to become impossible to stop. And that could completely redefine how Barcelona play this season. So in this video, we're going beyond the transfer headlines, we'll analyse every major signing, how they fit into Flick's tactical blueprint, why Barcelona may have deliberately ignored their biggest weakness, and whether this might be the masterstroke that finally brings the Champions League back to Camp Nou, or the gamble that could cost them everything. Because the more I studied Barcelona's squad, the more I realised this transfer window wasn't random. Every decision points towards one very specific idea. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So let's begin. Before we talk about Barcelona's new signings, we first need to understand what actually happened last season. Because strangely enough, winning wasn't the problem. Barcelona retained La Liga, retained the Spanish Cup, finished comfortably ahead of Real Madrid, and for long periods looked like one of Europe's most exciting sides. By almost every domestic measure, the season was a success. Yeah, if you ask most Barcelona supporters how they felt when the season ended, very few could call it satisfying. Why? Because modern Barcelona are no longer judged solely by their achievements in Spain, they're judged by their achievements in Europe. And once again, Europe exposed them. Against Atletico, Barcelona discovered something they had been avoiding all season. Their attack could overwhelm almost anyone, but when the margins became smaller and the tactical battles became tighter, their weaknesses became impossible to hide. The defensive line lacked authority, the squad lacked depth in key moments, and perhaps most importantly, the physical demands of Hansi Flick's football began catching up with them. By the end of the campaign, injuries were everywhere, fatigue had become obvious. The intensity that had made Barcelona so devastating during the first half of the season was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. And this was the first clue. So let's start with the first piece of the puzzle. Now at first glance, Barcelona's transfer window feels incomplete. When you lose knockout ties because of defensive mistakes, the logical response is simple. Buy defenders, strengthen the backline, become harder to score against. Instead, Barcelona went shopping somewhere completely different. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. It was almost as if Hansi Flick looked at last season and came to a completely different conclusion from everyone else. Which brings us back to the question that defined this entire video. Why would a team whose biggest weakness was arguably its defense spend almost all of its energy strengthening the attack? At first, I thought it made no sense, but then, the more I looked at every signing, the more one pattern kept appearing. It wasn't about replacing players. Every major addition to this squad points in exactly the same direction. Speed, intensity, verticality, and relentless running. And that's where I think we've all been looking at this transfer window the wrong way. Because Barcelona weren't trying to replace individuals, they were trying to reinforce an identity. Think about Hansi Flick's football for a second. At Bayern, his team didn't defend by sitting deep, they defended by overwhelming you. By winning the ball back before the opposition could even establish possession, his best defensive weapon was often his attack. And when you look at Barcelona's recruitment through that lens, everything suddenly starts to make sense. Anthony Gordon, Karim Adeyemi, Jesse Basiru, three completely different players, yet all three of them share one defining characteristic: they can run. Relentlessly, not just with the ball, but also without it. Closing passing lanes, leading the counter-attack, attacking the space behind the defense, and tracking back when possession is lost. They're not simply attackers, they're transition players. And in Hansi Flick's football, transition is everything. We've spoken about this on this channel before. Barcelona's defensive line often receives criticism. People see the high line and immediately assume that that's where the problem begins. But that's really the full story, because a high line only works if the players ahead of it do their jobs. The first line of defense isn't the centre backs, it's the front three. If the press arrives late, the defense gets exposed. If the press is coordinated, the defenders barely have anything to defend. That's why Hansi Flick doesn't just recruit goal scorers, he recruits athletes who can execute an idea. And suddenly, Barcelona's transfer strategy begins to look a lot less random. It looks intentional. But then there is one problem, because while Barcelona have added depth almost everywhere across the front line, they've simultaneously lost something even more important: Robert Lewandowski. Replacing goals is difficult. Replacing one of the greatest number 9s of this generation is almost impossible. And here's where Barcelona's summer takes another fascinating turn, because instead of finding another Lewandowski, they appear to have abandoned that search altogether. Not because they couldn't find one, but perhaps because Hansi Flick no longer wants to build his attack around one player. And if that's true, then Barcelona's entire attacking structure is about to change.
Maybe it's the time for us to stop thinking that teams nowadays need a striker. I mean, if you put Alan and Kane apart, you don't have strikers anymore.
Okay, for over 2 decades, Barcelona have almost always had one reference point in attack: Samuel Eto'o, David Villa, Luis Suarez, Robert Lewandowski. Different players, different eras, but they all served the same purpose. When Barcelona needed a goal, they knew exactly where it was supposed to come from. Now, for the first time in a very long time, that certainty has disappeared. Robert Lewandowski's departure doesn't just leave behind goals, it leaves behind an identity, because replacing one of the greatest goal scorers of this generation isn't something you simply solve in one transfer window. And perhaps Barcelona have realized that. Think about the striker market today. Erling Haaland, Harry Kane, elite number 9s are becoming increasingly rare. And when they do become available, they cost extraordinary amounts of money. Barcelona simply aren't operating in that market, which explains something else: their pursuit of Julian Alvarez. At first, it looked like Barcelona was searching for Lewandowski's replacement, but the more you analyze it, the more it becomes clear. They weren't looking for another Lewandowski, they were looking for a different profile entirely. Someone mobile, aggressive without the ball, comfortable rotating across the front line, able to initiate the press rather than simply finishing off the move. Now, the transfer may not have materialized, but I think it revealed exactly what Hansi Flick wants from his next striker. And once that move failed, Barcelona faced a decision: spend big on the wrong player or completely rethink the attack. I think they've chosen the second option, because maybe the next Barcelona wouldn't have a 30 to 40 goal striker at all. Maybe those goals will need to be shared across the entire team. Think about last season: Marc Bernal, Fermin Lopez, Dani Olmo all arriving late into the box, all contributing goals from midfield. Lamine Yamal constantly attacking the inside channel. Rafinha becoming a second striker whenever Barcelona entered the final third.
Rafinha, oh, brilliant!
We've already started seeing the blueprint. The striker isn't disappearing, his responsibilities are simply being redistributed. Instead of asking one player to score 35 goals, Barcelona might ask 6 players to score 15. It's harder to defend, it's also harder to predict, and perhaps far better suited to the squad that Hansi Flick now has available. But here's the fascinating part: if goals are now going to come from everywhere, then everyone has to attack. Midfielders, wingers, fullbacks, and even the pivots. And that changes everything, because suddenly Barcelona's transfer strategy starts making even more sense. They weren't replacing Robert Lewandowski, they were actually replacing his goals, and collectively. Which then brings us to the biggest tactical shift of all, because if every player is expected to contribute in attack, how do you stop the entire team from becoming completely exposed? That's the question Hansi Flick now has to answer, and I think he already has. So if Barcelona aren't relying on one striker anymore, and they're asking goals to come from everywhere, there's one obvious question: who protects the team when everyone attacks? Because football has always been a game of balance. Every extra body you commit forward is one fewer player protecting your own goal. And this is exactly where I think Hansi Flick's real gamble begins. Because contrary to what many people believe, I don't think Barcelona have ignored the defense. I think they've chosen to defend differently. One of the biggest misconceptions about attacking football is that it is only about creating chances. It isn't. The best attacking teams also happen to be some of the best defensive teams, not because they sit deep, but because they defend by controlling where the game is played. Think about Pep Guardiola's Man City, Hansi Flick's Bayern, or Luis Enrique's PSG. All of them played with incredibly high defensive lines, yet they rarely looked exposed for long periods. Why? Because they defended before the opposition could even begin an attack. The press wasn't simply designed to win the ball back, it was designed to stop transitions before they ever developed. And that's exactly why Barcelona's recruitment suddenly starts making perfect sense. Anthony Gordon, Karim Adeyemi, Jesse Basiru, none of these players were signed because of their prolific goal-scoring records. No, they were signed because they can sustain intensity for 90 minutes again and again and again. That intensity is what allows Barcelona to keep defending 40 meters away from their own goal, because once the first line of pressure collapses, the entire system starts collapsing with it. We've seen it ourselves over the past 2 seasons. Whenever Barcelona stopped pressing together, the high line suddenly looked reckless. The space becomes enormous, the centre-backs become isolated, and everyone blamed the defense. But perhaps the real problem wasn't the defenders at all, perhaps the press had already filled 20 meters higher up the pitch. That changes how we should think about the squad, because Barcelona aren't trying to become physically stronger in defense, they're trying to spend less time defending altogether. That's a completely different philosophy, which then explains something else. Something I found really interesting when looking at the squad. Barcelona haven't just increased the number of attackers, they've increased the number of players capable of rotating across the front line. Look at Anthony Gordon, naturally a left winger, but comfortable attacking the central spaces. Adeyemi usually starts wide, yet constantly attacks the inside. Rafinha is equally comfortable drifting centrally. Lamine Yamal starts on the touchline, but ends up between defenders. Even Dani Olmo and Fermin Lopez constantly occupy striker positions when Barcelona attack. This isn't coincidence, it's organized chaos. Everyone rotates, everyone interchanges, everyone attacks different spaces, which makes Barcelona incredibly difficult to mark because the reference points constantly disappear. One moment is going to be Rafinha dropping, the next one is Lamine Yamal running in behind, or even Fermin Lopez arriving late, then Dani Olmo, then Marc Bernal. The defensive line never gets to settle, and that is precisely what Hansi Flick wants. Constant movement, constant uncertainty, and constant pressure. Because uncertainty creates hesitation, and hesitation creates chances. But every philosophy has a weakness, and this one is no different. The more players commit forward, the greater the responsibility becomes for everyone else. The pivots have to cover impossible distances, and fullbacks have to judge exactly when to advance. The counter press has to be perfectly coordinated. One mistake, one missed trigger, one player pressing half a second too late, and suddenly the entire system can unravel. We've seen it happen before, not because the idea was wrong, but because elite football punishes tiny mistakes. Which means this season, Barcelona probably won't win because they have the best defense, they'll only win if they can make defending happen as little as possible. And that might just be Hansi Flick's biggest gamble yet. Because if this works, Barcelona won't simply be difficult to stop, they'll become one of the most relentless attacking sides in Europe. But if it doesn't, the exact same philosophy could once again cost them on the biggest stage. So looking at the squad as a whole, what should we actually expect from Barcelona this season?